Joe Henderson always knew living near an HOA was like poking a bear. Annoying, risky, but manageable if you kept your distance. But he never dreamed the bear would pour sand into his damn tractor. Yet there he stood, staring at all Betsy, his beloved machine that tilled his fields for years, now choked with grit so thick its engine might as well be a sandbox. It was deader than his Uncle Ray's hairline, and Joe's gut screamed one name: Corinne Whitmore, the HOA's self-anointed dictator who'd spent 6 months waging war on anything she deemed an eyesore. She'd already fined him twice, once for parking his truck too visibly in his own driveway, once for leaving his porch light on past 10, like some petty tyrant who ironed her socks and snitched on kids' lemonade stands. But this was next-level spite. Joe wiped a hand down his face, frustration boiling over like chili left too long on the stove. He turned Betsy's key again just to be sure, but all she gave was a grinding wheeze, a death rattle that hit him like losing an old friend. "Son of a," he muttered, kicking the dirt, eyes scanning his quiet property. No one around, but he felt her presence like a bad itch. Corinne had been here, he'd bet his farm on it. She'd been hounding him for weeks, dropping hints about cleaning up his land, griping that his tractor ruined the neighborhood. Aesthetic harmony. Joe figured she'd try something stupid, but sabotage. That was bold, even for her. He stormed back to the house, yanked open the door, and beelined for his security monitor. Cameras he'd installed after her last HOA stunt, not because he'd planned to need them, but because Corinne's vibe screamed trouble waiting to happen. He scrolled to the previous night's footage, and there she was. Corinne creeping onto his land like a raccoon with a law degree, lugging a heavy bag, sand, no doubt. The video caught her pouring it straight into Betsy's engine, and then the kicker. She did a little fist pump, strutting off like she'd just pulled off a master heist. Joe's blood pressure spiked to doctor warning levels. This wasn't petty HOA nonsense anymore. This was vandalism, destruction of property, war. Without a second thought, he grabbed his keys and marched down the road to her pristine beige monstrosity of a house. A place so spotless it'd probably never seen a dust mote. He didn't knock, he pounded the door like a tax collector on a mission. Corinne answered, coffee mug in hand. "Live, laugh, lead the HOA," scrawled on it, feigning surprise. "Oh, Joe," she cooed, voice syrupy, "to what do I owe this?" "You poured sand in my tractor engine," he growled. She blinked, then let out a laugh that made his fists itch. "Joe, that's a serious accusation. I think you need to calm down before you regret saying that." He pulled out his phone, flipped it to her, and hit play. The footage rolled in crisp HD. Corinne, the sand, the fist pump undeniable. Her smile twitched just a hair, but enough. "Oh my," she muttered, hand to chest like he'd accused her of torching an orphanage. "Well, that could be anyone." Joe stared, incredulous. "Corinne, you danced," she huffed, spine stiffening. "This is absurd, even if, and I say if, that's me, do you really think you can do anything? The HOA board won't back you. You've been a menace since you moved in. That tractor's a blight. Frankly, I did everyone a favor." Joe took a slow breath, the kind that kept him from punching drywall. "You just admitted it." "Please," she scoffed, "it's my word against yours, and you can't afford to fight me. Tractors are expensive. Maybe keep your junkyard hidden next time." That was it, Joe decided then and there. Corinne wasn't just paying for Betsy, she'd regret crossing him. Corinne's smug dismissal, "It's my word against yours," lit a fire in Joe that burned hotter than a summer drought. She thought he'd slink off, grumble into his beer, and let her win, but she'd misjudged him bad. He gave her one long, slow look, the kind that promised trouble, and said, "I'll see you in court, Corinne," before turning on his heel and walking away, her sharp chuckle chasing him down the street. She didn't believe he'd do it, thought he was all bark, no bite. But Joe Henderson never let things go, not when they hit this deep. Betsy wasn't just a tractor. She was his lifeline, the machine that kept his fields alive, and Corinne had killed her out of spite, dancing like it was a game. By the time he got home, his mind was a storm of plans. He had the footage, crystal-clear proof, and now he needed the right weapon to wield it. He knew exactly who to call: Darla McBride, a local legend of a lawyer who carved up HOA tyrants like Thanksgiving turkey, the kind of woman whose name made board members whisper in fear. Joe grabbed his phone, grinning for the first time that morning, and dialed. "Darla," he said when her crisp voice answered, "I've got a case for you. Trust me, you're gonna love this one." There was a pause, then a slow, delighted chuckle on the other end. "Tell me everything," she said, and Joe unloaded it all, the sand, the footage, Corinne's smug fist pump, her half-assed denial at the door. When he finished, Darla let out a low whistle. "You've got video proof, crystal clear?" Inglorious 4K, Joe confirmed. Oh, this is gonna be fun, she said, a wicked edge sharpening her tone. Let's ruin her. Joe leaned back in his chair, satisfaction settling in like a warm blanket. Karen thought her HOA badge made her untouchable. But Darla was a wolf with a taste for petty dictators, and Joe had just handed her a feast. They set a meeting for the next day, and Joe spent the evening replaying the footage, imagining Karen's face when she realized her little stunt was about to cost her everything. She'd underestimated him, figured he didn't have the cash or the guts to fight back. But with Darla in his corner, this wasn't just a battle. It was a slaughter waiting to happen. The courthouse loomed a few weeks later, smelling of old books, cheap coffee, and tension so thick it pressed on your chest. Joe sat on the plaintiff's side, arms crossed, watching Karen play innocent, pearl necklace gleaming, posture ramrod straight like she hadn't a care in the world. Darla sat beside him, a force in a navy suit, tapping her legal pad with a predator's patience. She didn't need notes. She'd taken down a dozen Karens before, and this one was next. Karen's lawyer, a jittery kid who looked fresh out of law school or coerced into this mess, fumbled his papers, stealing nervous glances at his client. She ignored him, her face a mask of mild amusement. Joe could practically hear her thoughts. This is a joke, he doesn't stand a chance. The bailiff called for silence, and the judge, a stern man with tired eyes, cleared his throat. Joseph Henderson versus Karen Whitmore, he began. Mr. Henderson, you're claiming the defendant sabotaged your tractor, causing damage requiring full replacement, correct? Joe nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The judge turned to Karen. And you deny this? She smiled, sweet as poison. Absolutely, Your Honor, just a misunderstanding. Darla chuckled beside Joe, low and lethal, and he knew Karen was about to learn what misunderstanding really meant. The courtroom hummed with anticipation as Darla rose, heels clicking sharp against the floor, her presence slicing through Karen's feigned innocence like a blade through butter. Your Honor, she said, voice smooth and commanding, I'd like to submit Exhibit A security footage from Mr. Henderson's property, taken the night before his tractor became inoperable. She handed a flash drive to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge, and Joe caught the faintest twitch in Karen's jaw, her mask holding but cracking. The video played on the courtroom screen, and there she was in glorious high-def. Karen sneaking onto Joe's land under moonlight, hauling a bag of sand, dumping it into all Betsy's engine with surgical precision, then capping it off with that ridiculous fist pump before strutting away like a petty crime champ. Silence stretched long after it ended, broken by a cough, then a stifled laugh from the back. Someone couldn't hold it in. Joe kept his eyes forward, resisting the urge to see Karen squirm, though a smirk tugged at his lips. The judge adjusted his glasses, staring at her with a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, voice dry, do you have anything to say about this footage? Karen straightened, hand to chest. Your Honor, while that may look like me, Darla snorted, loud enough to echo, and Karen shot her a glare before pressing on. There's no conclusive proof I caused any damage. For all we know, that tractor was already on its last legs. It's ancient. Joe's jaw clenched. All Betsy was old, sure, but she'd been purring like a kitten before Karen's sand stunt and calling her junk stung deep. The judge rubbed his temples, clearly done with her already. Mrs. Whitmore, are you suggesting a bag of sand just coincidentally ended up in the engine the night before it died? Karen clasped her hands, prim and defiant. I'm saying there's reasonable doubt. Darla stood again, her calm dripping with menace. Your Honor, if I may, Exhibit B, footage from a neighbor's security camera that same night, showing the defendant returning home with sand on her shoes. The screen lit up again. Karen, dragging her bag back, light-colored shoes dusted with telltale grit, footprints trailing her like a confession. Her face paled, just a shade, and Joe wondered if she'd ever considered how dumb it was to wear white sneakers for a crime. Her lawyer piped up, voice shaky. Your Honor, we argue that even if my client was present, intent must be proven beyond reasonable doubt. The judge's eyebrow twitched. Are you seriously suggesting she dumped sand into a tractor engine by accident? Karen pursed her lips, silent, and Joe caught Darla's grin. She had her cornered. Your Honor, Darla said, smooth as silk, Mr. Henderson seeks $40,000 for a full tractor replacement plus $10,000 in punitive damages. Given the overwhelming evidence, we believe this is more than fair. Karen let out a high, manic laugh. $50,000 over a piece of farm equipment. He could have just cleaned it out. Darla turned to her, all business. Mrs. Whitmore, you didn't inconvenience my client. You destroyed a vital part of his livelihood. That tractor wasn't an ornament. It was a working machine he depended on, and you sabotaged it with intent. Corinne's fingers gripped the table, panic flickering in her eyes for the first time. The judge sighed, looking at her like she was a puzzle he didn't want to solve. Mrs. Whitmore, this court finds you liable for the damages. You're ordered to pay $40,000 for the replacement and $10,000 in punitive damages. Legally binding, not a suggestion. Her face went sour milk white, and Joe leaned back, satisfaction washing over him. Corinne was done, and he'd just lit the fuse on her downfall. The gavel's crack sealed Corinne's fate. $50,000 owed, her HOA queen facade shattered, and Joe felt the victory sink in like a cold beer on a hot day, sharp and sweet. Corinne's face twisted, a strangled noise escaping her, half laugh, half sob as the judge's words hung heavy. Legally binding, not a suggestion. Her lawyer slumped, a defeated heap who'd clearly regretted taking her case the second Darla hit play, while Joe kept his smirk in check, savoring the moment without gloating yet. The judge's tired glare pinned Corinne, daring her to argue, but she just sputtered. You can't be serious. He shot back a look that said he'd never been more serious, adding, if you don't comply, legal action will ensure payment. She turned on Joe as the room emptied, venom in her hiss. This isn't over. He smiled, calm and final. Oh, it is. Then he walked out, Darla at his side, her grin wicked as she muttered, told you we'd ruin her. The courthouse air felt lighter as he stepped into the sun. Corinne wasn't just beaten, she was broken, and Joe had a front row seat to the show about to unfold. She'd stormed out like a woman possessed, but he knew her type. Dignity wasn't in her playbook, only spite. The fallout hit fast, spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire. Corinne Whitmore, enforcer of porch-light curfews and truck parking rules, exposed as a vandal forced to shell out a fortune. HOA members who'd cowered under her reign saw their shot and took it. At the next meeting, Joe didn't even need to show up to hear the details. Corinne faced a mutiny. Richard, an older guy fined thrice for whimsical wind chimes, called Joe later, laughing so hard he could barely talk. She tried defending herself, said she acted for the community's best interest, and someone yelled, "Was the sand part of your community service?" The room erupted, the vote to oust her unanimous. Joe figured she'd slink off after that, lick her wounds, maybe find a shred of humility, but Corinne didn't do quiet exits. Instead, she doubled down with petty revenge. First, his mail started arriving late, the carrier, Dave, admitting she'd been loitering by the post box, ranting about neighborhood integrity loud enough to slow him down. Joe shrugged it off, but then she escalated, parking her car just close enough to his driveway to make pulling out a hassle. Not illegal, just infuriating. He didn't bite, though, made a show of backing out slow, waving at her lurking in her window, grinning like it was a game he'd already won. The final straw landed a week later. A new HOA violation letter taped to his mailbox, unsigned and unofficial, claiming his porch light broke some unwritten rule. Joe read it, dramatic, absurd, and laughed so hard he nearly keeled over. He marched to her house, knocked, and when she opened the door, he held it up, still chuckling. You know you're not in charge anymore, right? Her face twisted, fury blazing. You're a menace, Joseph Henderson. You put sand in my tractor, he shot back, eyebrow raised. She sniffed, defiant. That's still up for debate. Joe sighed, more amused than mad. I was gonna let this go, thought you learned something, but if you want games, fine. You owe me 50 grand, Corinne. I'd save your energy for that bill. Fear flickered in her eyes, real and raw. The lawsuit was one thing, but the cash hanging over her head was a noose she couldn't dodge. She slammed the door and Joe walked off, knowing he'd just landed another blow. She was unraveling and he was loving every second. Corinne's door slamming in Joe's face felt like a victory lap. He'd rattled her, and that flicker of fear in her eyes told him the $50,000 noose was tightening. She wanted to keep poking with her petty mailbox stunts and driveway games, but Joe's reminder of the cash she owed flipped the script. She wasn't just beaten, she was cornered, and he could taste her panic as he walked back home. The neighborhood buzz kept growing. Corinne's ousting from the HOA wasn't just gossip, it was a seismic shift. People who'd tiptoed around her for years were suddenly bold, swapping stories of her reign like war veterans trading scars. Richard stopped by one evening, still chuckling about the meeting. She's done, Joe, nobody's scared of her anymore. You should have seen her face when they voted her out, red as a tomato, stammering about standards. Joe grinned, sipping a beer on his porch, imagining her squirming. He'd figured she'd fade after that, maybe sell her pride and move on, but then he saw it. A "for sale" sign stabbed into her pristine lawn, bold and final. It hit him slow, like dawn creeping over the fields. Corinne Whitmore, the HOA's iron-fisted queen, was leaving, broken by her own mess. He didn't feel a lick of pity. She'd brought it on herself, pouring sand into all Betsy, thinking her badge made her invincible. A week later, he was tinkering with his brand-new tractor, shiny, paid for by her court-ordered check, when Hank rolled up, his best friend since forever, a mischievous glint in his eye. "You hear about Corinne?" Hank asked, rocking back on his heels. Joe leaned against the tractor, wiping grease off his hands. "If you're saying she faked her death and fled, I'm all ears." Hank chuckled. "Not quite, she's selling the house." Joe smirked. "Already know that." But Hank's grin widened and he pulled a set of keys from his pocket, dangling them like a trophy. "You don't know who's buying it." Joe tilted his head. "Who?" Hank jangled the keys. "Me." Joe blinked, then blinked again, then roared with laughter so loud it sent birds scattering. "You're kidding." "Not even a little," Hank said, smug as hell. "Got a steal, too." She was desperate to ditch it. Joe shook his head, disbelief turning to delight. "So, she pays for my tractor, gets booted from the HOA, sells her house, and now you're moving in." Hank clapped Joe's shoulder, grinning like a kid with a slingshot. "Yep, and I'm gonna make full use of that front yard. Big ugly garden gnomes, maybe some flamingos, hell, I might paint the place neon green just to twist the knife." Joe wiped a fake tear, still laughing. "Hank, you're a gift." The day Corinne moved out, Joe parked himself on his porch, beer in hand, watching movers haul her curated furniture into a truck. She didn't glance his way, face set like stone, lips pursed tight enough to crack walnuts, defeated utterly, and Joe savored it. Hank wandered over, beer of his own, nodding at the new tractor gleaming in the yard. "What are you nomming this one?" Joe thought for a beat, then grinned. "Justice." Hank snorted. "Fitting." They clinked bottles, watching Corinne's car peel out, her reign of HOA terror vanishing down the road. Joe took a long sip, leaning back, a sigh of pure contentment escaping him. Peace at last, hard-won and perfect, with Corinne's downfall the cherry on top. She messed with the wrong guy, and now she'd live with Hank's flamingos as her parting gift. Corinne's taillights fatting down the street marked the end of an era, and Joe felt the weight of her reign lift like fog burning off a morning field. Peace settled in, real and unbroken, with Hank's gleeful promise of neon green paint and tacky gnomes adding a twist of poetic justice. She poured sand into all Betsy, thinking she'd bury Joe's spirit along with his tractor, but instead she dug her own grave. $50,000 deep, HOA crown snatched. House sold to the one guy guaranteed to make her legacy a laughingstock. Joe leaned back on his porch that night, justice gleaming in the yard, a cold beer sweating in his hand, and let the satisfaction soak in. She'd lost everything, and he'd come out with a new machine and a story to tell for years. The neighborhood felt different now, lighter. Folks who'd ducked Corinne's wrath for ages started nodding at him again, some even stopping by to chat about her downfall like it was a local holiday. Richard swung by the next day, still cackling about the HOA mutiny. "She's gone for good, Joe. Heard she's moving clear across the state, probably to terrorize some other poor suckers." Joe grinned. "Good riddance. Just hope they've got a Darla over there." Hank, true to his word, wasted no time turning Corinne's old place into a glorious eyesore. By week's end, a squad of garish garden gnomes lined the lawn, their chipped paint and creepy smiles a perfect middle finger to her aesthetic harmony. He topped it off with a pair of plastic flamingos, one leg each snapped off, staked proudly by the mailbox she'd once policed like a hawk. Joe drove by one evening, saw Hank out front with a can of spray paint, eyeing the trim with a devilish grin, and laughed so hard he nearly swerved off the road. "You're really doing it," he called out. Hank waved the can. "Neon greens on backorder, settling for electric blue till it ships." Joe shook his head, marveling. Corinne's pristine beige kingdom was dead, replaced by Hank's gleeful chaos, and every tacky touch felt like a victory lap. The HOA stayed quiet, licking its wounds after the trial's spotlight. No more violation letters, no more petty fines. Joe's porch light burned bright past 10 without a peep, a small rebellion he savored every night. But Corinne's ghost lingered, a faint itch Joe couldn't scratch. She wasn't the type to fade without a parting shot. A week after the move, a letter slid into his mailbox. No stamp, just his name in her sharp scrawl. He tore it open, expecting venom, and got it. "You think this is over, Henderson, but I'll be back. Enjoy your little win while it lasts." He snorted, tossing it into the drawer with her fake violation note. Another toothless threat from a woman with no teeth left to bear. Milo, his old mutt, nosed at his leg, whining like he sensed the spite in the air, and Joe scratched his ears. "She's got nothing, boy, just barking at shadows now." Still, he called Darla, casual-like, and read her the note. She laughed, low and mean. "Let her try. I've got a file on her thick enough to bury her twice." Joe hung up, reassured but watchful. Karen was down, not out, and he'd learned never to underestimate her spite. For now, though, he had justice, a quiet farm, and Hank's flamingos keeping her memory in check. Peace reigned. But he kept one eye open, just in case her shadow crept back. Karen's letter sat in Joe's drawer like a loaded gun with no bullets. Her threat to be back rang hollow, but it kept him sharp, a reminder of the venom she'd spewed even as her world collapsed. He'd shown it to Hank over beers the next night, and his friend cackled, slapping the table. "She's got no juice left, Joe. Probably wrote it in a motel somewhere, crying into her HOA rulebook." Joe grinned, sipping slow, picturing her fuming in some nowhere town, plotting a comeback she'd never pull off. The farm hummed with calm. Justice purred through the fields, cutting clean rows where all Betsy once reigned, and the neighborhood settled into a rhythm free of Karen's petty tyranny. Folks waved again, unafraid of her clipboard shadow. Richard dropped by with a jar of homemade jam, grinning about how his wind chimes rang loud now, no fines in sight. "You did us all a favor, Joe," he said, and Joe shrugged. "Just saved my tractor, rest was a bonus." But it felt good, knowing her reign was dust, replaced by Hank's flamingo-strewn chaos next door. Electric blue trim freshly painted, gnomes multiplying like rabbits, a neon green shipment still on its way. Still, that itch lingered. Karen wasn't one to slink off forever, and Joe kept his cameras rolling, half expecting her to try something dumb. A week later, word trickled in from Dave, the mail carrier. She'd been spotted an hour away, ranting to some poor clerk about property injustices, her face red enough to stop traffic. "She's unhinged," Dave said, shaking his head. "But nobody's buying her sob story, kept yelling about you, though." Joe smirked, let her yell. Every tantrum dug her deeper, and Darla's file was ready if she stepped out of line. Then came the call from Darla herself, voice crisp and amused. "Your girl," in hot water, HOA's old treasurer flipped, handed over records showing she'd skimmed dues for years. States sniffing around now, fraud charges pending. Joe whistled low. "She's cooked, burnt to a crisp," Darla said, laughing. "That $50,000 is the least of her worries. She's looking at jail time." He hung up, leaning against Justice, the news sinking in. Karen wasn't just down, she was buried, her own greed piling the dirt. Hank rolled up later, catching the grin on Joe's face. "What's got you so chipper? Karen's facing fraud, might trade her pearls for prison stripes." Hank whooped, raising an imaginary glass. "To justice and justice." The farm felt lighter after that, the last threads of Karen's shadow snapping loose. Joe took to sitting on his porch nights, Milo at his feet, watching the stars over fields she couldn't touch, peace pure and earned. Hank's place glowed next door, a tacky beacon of her defeat, and every flamingo felt like a trophy. A few days later, a postcard arrived, no return address, just a grainy photo of a jail cell and 3 words in her scrawl. "You'll regret this." Joe laughed loud and long, pinning it to his fridge like a badge, her last gasp, powerless and pathetic. He called Darla again, read it out, and she snorted. "She's delusional states got her dead to rights. She's not seeing daylight for a while." Joe nodded, satisfied. Karen could scribble threats till her hand fell off, but she'd lost the war the second she crossed him. The neighborhood thrived in her absence, his tractor roared, and Hank's gnomes stood guard. Her comeback dreams were just that, dreams, and Joe slept sound knowing she'd never wake them into reality. Karen's jail cell postcard stayed pinned to Joe's fridge, a trophy of her downfall. Those 3 words, "You'll regret this," scrawled in her tight, furious hand, were the last whimper of a tyrant who'd lost everything but her spite. Darla's call the next day sealed it. "She's locked up, pleaded guilty to fraud after the state piled on evidence. 2 years, maybe more if she keeps mouthing off." Joe grinned, leaning against Justice, the new tractor humming in the yard. Karen wasn't just beaten, she was caged, her HOA crown melted down by her own scams. The $50,000 she paid him was pocket change compared to the restitution she owed the neighborhood. Dues she'd skimmed, fines she'd pocketed, all exposed when the treasurer flipped. Hank whooped when Joe told him, raising a beer on the porch that night. To the Sand Queen, may her cell be as beige as her house. They clinked bottles, laughing as the stars glittered over fields Karen couldn't touch. Her reign a fatting echo drowned by the clatter of his tacky flamingos next door. Neon green had arrived, and the trim glowed like a radioactive taunt. The farm thrived in her absence. Justice cut through the soil like a dream, Milo dozed by the barn, and neighbors dropped by with grins instead of grievances. Richard brought a pie one afternoon, still chuckling about his wind chimes. Heard she tried blamming you in court, said you provoked her with that tractor. Judge didn't buy it for a second. Joe smirked, provoked. She danced after killing all Betsy. The only provocation was her own ego. The HOA dissolved not long after, too gutted by her fraud to limp on, and the street breathed free. No more violation slips, no more porch-light curfews. Hank turned Karen's old place into a glorious mess. Gnomes bred like weeds, flamingos multiplied, and he'd added a rusted tractor chassis to the yard, for irony, he said, winking. Joe drove by daily, laughing at the chaos, each garish touch a nail in her legacy's coffin. The postcard faded on the fridge, ink blurring, but he kept it. Proof she'd swung and missed, her final threat as empty as her promises of aesthetic harmony. Months later, Dave the mail carrier stopped by, grinning. Got a letter from her, certified, addressed to you. Didn't open it, but it's thick, probably a novel's worth of whining. Joe took it, tore it open, and skimmed, pages of rage, calling him a menace, swearing she, Sue from prison, claiming the neighborhood needed her. He laughed loud enough to startle Milo and tossed it into the fire pit, let her waste her stamps. She'd lost the second she crossed him. Darla called a week after, amused. She's filing motions, claims entrapment, says you set her up with that camera. Judge laughed it out of court. Joe shook his head, delusional to the end. He sat on his porch that night, beer in hand, watching Hank adjust a new gnome, this one holding a tiny sandbag. Too much, Hank called. Perfect, Joe yelled back, grinning. Karen had wanted him crushed, thought sand would break him, but she'd only fueled his win. Justice roared, his fields grew, and her beige empire was Hank's neon playground. She'd regret crossing him, not the other way around, locked away while he savored the quiet she'd never steal again. Joe took a long sip, leaned back, and sighed. Peace at last, with her downfall the sweetest harvest he'd ever reaped. Game over, Karen. He'd buried her, and the gnomes danced on her grave.